Thanks for joining us for the third session of the day on evolution, religion, and the question of authority. And our first panelist today is going to be Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is Professor of Nuclear and High Energy Physics, as well as Chairman at the Department of Physics at Quaid-e-Azam, did I say that right? University in Islamabad. And he's going to be talking about Science as Silent Subversion, Experiences from Pakistan.
Thank you, Laura. Delighted to be here. There's a question that's bothered me for many years. That outstanding question is, why are there so many Muslims with substantial technical skills who have become politically radicalized? As I look around myself in Islamabad, I see that my students, and then those students who then go on to the Pakistan Institute for Nuclear Science and Technology, or other defense-related organizations, or other places in society, they are perhaps more conservative than the general public. I also see that this is not just limited to my university, but is true pretty much across Pakistan, and I dare say it's now something that's true across the world. If one looks at the bombers who participated in 7/7, if one looks at the 9/11 crew, well, a lot of them were technicians, engineers, doctors. And so this is something of a puzzlement, because when science came to Europe, we saw that the impact of religion was gradually whittled away. And yet over here it seems to be going in the other direction, so the question is why? Well, a lot of us, including myself, that is, when I began teaching, the hope was that science teaching would be something like a Trojan horse. And as you all remember, something like a few thousand years ago, the city of Troy had been surrounded by the Greeks, and the Greeks surrounded it for 10 years, and they couldn't get in. And then they made that marvelous horse, and the Trojans pulled it in, and then out came the Greek crack warriors, and, well, they took over Troy. So the hope was that here is science which has a marvelous exterior. It brings you technology, and it's welcome everywhere. It's welcome even with the Taliban. The Taliban use SUVs. They use a sophisticated communication system that the Pakistan Army can't crack. And they've been using mobile transmitters in the area of Swat, and they've done very well for themselves in certain applications of technology. So the hope was that, okay, this Trojan horse of science will get into the citadels of conservatism and launch those crack warriors from inside. That is, that idea of rationality, that idea of logic and reason reigning in the universe. Well, it hasn't happened. And instead what we've seen is that, just like in the Greek times, there was Cassandra who was warning, futile in that case, but here there are lots of Cassandras, and they are warning that you're letting a Trojan horse in. So I would like to, in these few minutes that I have, categorize the sort of responses that Islamic society, and in particular Pakistani society, has come up with as science seeks to penetrate it. I guess you could call it, you could make an analogy with an immune system. So as a foreign microorganism comes into that body, it provokes the immune system to respond. So let's try and categorize what these responses are. Well, the first response is to ignore science but to welcome technology. Actually, the Saudis are very clear about that, and Quite a few years ago, there was a conference on how to promote science and technology in the Muslim world. The Saudis has a very definite position. They said, we want the technology, we want the cars and the aircraft and the oil drilling rigs and so forth, but we don't want science because science can be destructive. Well, so maybe it is true that you can ignore science but have a lot of technology. After all, you don't need to know how a cell phone works in order to use it. You don't need to know how the engine of a car works in order to drive it. And even in terms of designing a lot of stuff, like, for example, missiles, you can buy, for example, accelerometers, or you can buy the chips that can be used for the guidance. You don't need to know how those little things inside work. You don't need to make the integrated circuits. You can just use it. It's functionality that's important. Of course, ignoring science in this way is possible, and it doesn't touch upon faith. There are, in these days, no grand disputes like at the time of Galileo. There are no things that can harm theological beliefs. So if you want to design a bridge or a robot or a new kind of drug or whatever, it's not going to be dangerous to the faith. Well, of course, if you want to become a cosmologist or you want to understand the interpretations of quantum mechanics or perhaps want to do neuroscience, then it becomes a little tricky, because then it does require you to understand, absorb, and internalize the scientific method itself. Anyway, that's the dominant response that I see in much of the Muslim world. And frankly, there is quite a bit of that you see in the rest of the world too, because things have become so complex. Who understands exactly how everything works? Nobody. And you have to then rely upon simple functionality. Well, the Cassandras had long warned that science is dangerous, and it's dangerous if you accept that everything that you see in the material world follows from science. So let me come to the second response of this immune system. The second response is to sever the relationship between cause and effect. Because if you accept that, then you give primacy to the role of physical law in the universe. This argument goes back, at least 1,000 years ago. There was an argument between the Ash'arites and between the Mu'tazila in the early days of Islamic society. There are famous examples that I'm sure that people over here are familiar with Imam al-Ghazali saying, a piece of cotton doesn't burn just because you put a match to it. It burns because God sends down the angels, and it's the angels who are actually doing the burning. And then there was the argument of the Ash'arites that don't ever think that an arrow that is speeding towards its target will actually hit the target no matter how close it gets to it. So even as it gets that far or even closer, you can't say it'll go and hit the target, because God creates the world in 1 second, destroys it in the next, creates it again, destroys it in the next, and so forth. And so there's no causal link between one time slice and another. This kind of reasoning was taken over in chemistry textbooks at the time of General Ziaul Haq in Pakistan. So some of these textbooks had typically something like this. Rather, instructions to teachers to teach from that textbook go something like this, that don't tell your students that merely having oxygen and hydrogen together will make water. That is not Islamic. The Islamic way to teach chemistry is to say that when hydrogen and oxygen are brought together, then by the will of Allah, they turn into water. Similarly, I guess alcohol. But these ideas you might think were peripheral, but over time they did have an impact. Let me give you an example of how they have affected the way in which students think. So this is the 8th of October 2005. There's a massive earthquake in Pakistan. It killed something like 100,000 people. Together with a few colleagues, I took some relief supplies to the areas, to the mountainous areas where the epicenter was located. I came back, or rather we came back in a couple of days, saw that enormous destruction. And the day I came back, I had 2 classes. In the first class I went, I said, I've just come back, seen all the horrors, and it's our duty, first as citizens, to go out and help them, and secondly, as students of physics, to tell them that the earthquake didn't come because of what is commonly believed, that it was the wrath of God, but that they were actually a movement, there was a movement of tectonic plates, and there's the phenomenon of subduction, and this is how mountains are formed, and this is why the earth quakes, and so forth. So I went on for a few minutes about that. And I said, well, what do you think about it? By the way, this class was a class in atomic physics. It was I guess you'd call it a second-year undergraduate class in US terms. Okay, so I asked them, what do you think? And the reaction was outrage. But professor, the Quran says in Surah Zalzala, etc., 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 that God sends these earthquakes because you are evil. Okay? And this is the opinion in the class. And we argue about it. I say, but why did it come to an area where the people are poor, where they have the least ability to sin? It should come here in Islam, but because here you have people drinking alcohol and God knows what goes on in those rich areas of this city. So why did it come over there, and why did it come on a day when people were fasting, and this was Ramadan itself? Well, we argued. Not a person, not one student spoke up in support. Okay, I should have shut up. I went to my next class and I said exactly the same thing and got exactly the same response. And so I was very depressed. A few hours later, 5 students came up to me and they said, Professor, actually we agreed with you, but we were afraid to speak. And so you see that even something like this, something that directly relates to physics, they do not see in terms of cause and effect, and in fact feel that because religion says the other thing, they must reject it. Okay, so sever the relation of cause with effect, response type 2. I must say that it's not just earthquakes. It's on other issues too that relate to natural phenomena. There was a few years ago, I gave a lecture on Islam and science at one of the, at the most elite university in Pakistan called the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore. And, as an example, I said, at this moment, we have something like a few million people praying for rain, for ending the drought. And if you think that science is something that works, then you have to know that praying for rain will not work. And there was again outrage. And then this went on to the internet, it went to the administration of the university, which was informed that I have been saying things that are kufr, against unbelief and so forth. So That's response number 2. But let me come to response number 3. That response is that science is important, but who says that the West has the right science? We have an Islamic science that can do a lot more. And that was already written 1400 years ago. This was a time that General Ziaul Haq was in power. He had seized power in 1977. And although this notion had existed earlier, but it became immensely popular after he became president of Pakistan. Let me give you just a few examples of that. The chairman of my department, his name was Mahmoud Mazhar Qureshi, a man of great piety who calculated the speed at which heaven is running away from earth and found it to be 1 centimeter per second less than the speed of light. It was a remarkable calculation. He said, in the Quran, it is written that one night of worship on the night of Laylatul Qadr, which is when the Quran was revealed, is worth 1,000 normal nights of worship. So that factor of 1,000 is equal to Einstein's time dilation factor. And then it's right, it's 1 centimeter per second less than the speed of light. So it works. And there were people who were calculating the degree of hypocrisy in society based upon a kind of a Coulomb's law. And they did it for different countries and published their results. And then there was this remarkable paper by Sayyid Bashiruddin Mahmud, who advocated that one could solve the energy problems of Pakistan by simply capturing the genies which God had made when he made man. You see, he made all of you out of clay, but he made the angels and he made the genies out of fire, and fire is energy. And if we want energy, all we got to do is get them and, well, the problem is solved. You don't even need nuclear energy after that. Although he was a nuclear energy engineer, I must say not a bad engineer. There is a probe that is actually patented by him and that works. It's an international patent. And he is, by the way, the man who met Osama bin Laden just a few months before 9/11. He's been in house arrest since that time, been heavily interrogated. We had a relationship which wasn't friendly. In fact, it was quite acrimonious. I'd called him a nutcase, and he called me an anti-Islamic force, and so forth. But you see, this is a puzzlement. Here are people who are technically rather skilled. And if we are to believe him, he was the person who designed the reactor. And designing a reactor is not a small thing. The one that's now producing plutonium in Khushab. It's a military reactor. I frankly don't think that he did design it, but certainly he was the director of the project and had a substantial hand in it. This kind of Islamic science at one time was very popular. But because of its obviously ridiculous claims, it was easy to make fun of. And so it's now disappeared. Well, there's a fourth reaction, which is claim ownership by Muslims of all discoveries in science. So if you go to the websites, if you type Islamic science in Google, you'll get typically an internet banner which says that miracles predicted 1400 years ago, and everything from black holes to quantum mechanics to antibiotics, everything is over there. I wish I had time, but I could tell you about my experiences with conversations with mullahs. I asked one very prominent Maulvi mullah on television. I said, but if everything is over there in the Quran, how come the West has invented all of these and we don't have it? He said, what you don't know is that before a Western scientist goes to bed, he studies the Quran. In the morning when he wakes up, he reads it again. When he goes to his laboratory, he already knows what he's going to find. And then finally, there's a fifth response, and that's a militant rejection of scientific reasoning. But this is reserved for evolution. The times that I've experienced this is when I've gone to colleges, universities, schools, and given my talk, which is titled From Quarks to Humans. It's how we went from the Big Bang, came to humans. There have been times when the organizers have had to smuggle me out from the back door. This is the thing that makes people really angry. But this is something really, I think, recent. Because I've been doing this for decades now. But people in the last decade or so, the last 10 years, they've been responding differently. And I think I know why. It's because of the religious channels, the television channels, which are now taking Harun Yahya. Sorry to come back to that. But it's that version of evolution which is being consciously propagated. Okay, let me conclude. I wish I had more time, but okay, fine. We're seeing this resilience because all of us, Muslim or otherwise, see what we want to see. And the question that, Salman, we were discussing last night at dinner, why is it that bad beliefs don't die easily? Why do they persist? I think it's a question that I cannot answer, but I can hazard a guess. Bad beliefs stay on because they are necessary for our survival. Now imagine, I'll give you two examples. Imagine a caveman. Suppose that a caveman came out of his cave and his few experiences told him that there's no danger. But he's been born and programmed and told by his elders or whatever that whenever you come out of your cave, be prepared. Now, if he relaxes that, well, then he won't be able to survive. So exceptions have to be factored in. Or take the example of particle physicists. Okay, we have a reasonably solid theory of how different particles are formed from quarks. But suppose that there's one particle which doesn't fit the pattern. Am I going to throw away that whole field of quantum chromodynamics or that area of particle physics? No, I won't. I'll wait and wait and wait. And so even if there is evidence to the contrary, I'm not going to throw away the entire paradigm. I guess at some point one has to accept the change of paradigm, but when that comes, I don't know. So we cling on to the bad beliefs and we cling on to them. It's perhaps the next generation which can accept it. But this, to my mind, is an open question and one that I'd really like to understand better. So thanks very much.